Well, likewise, okay, if you pump more money into the economy in such a way as to force interest rates even lower, all you're doing is encouraging entrepreneurs to continue to squander resources on things that can't be finished. So all you're doing is making us even poorer. But that's what we're told needs to be done. Now notice, here's how we answer the initial question. Why is there the cluster of entrepreneurial error? And the answer is because the central bank distorts entrepreneurial calculation by interfering with the interest rate. Now, I will respond to the objection that, well, there were booms and busts before the Federal Reserve. That is quite answerable. But for now, the point is, this is not a free market outcome. This is an interventionist outcome that we have in our hands here. Now, this analogy from the master builder works both for producers and consumers, by which I mean, on the one hand, it's a great analogy to show how producers are misled into starting unsustainable projects. But it also works to account for what consumers are up to, because consumers get out of unsustainable consumption binges. When the Fed poured all the money into the economy that it did, particularly following 9/11, and there were all these regulatory factors tending to push that money into the mortgage market, it pushed housing prices very high, and it misled consumers about their net worth. A lot of consumers thought, hey, apparently I'm sitting on a $500,000 house, $5 cup of coffee at Starbucks is a mere bag of shells. In other words, people started on consumption patterns that they wouldn't have started on if they had actually seen the economy and their own net worth clearly. They wouldn't have done these things if they had known they don't really have $1 million in their retirement portfolio. That's a bubble. They don't really have a $500,000 house. That's a bubble. They were told by the experts, including Fed economists, that this is not a bubble. In fact, Alan Greenspan said it would be impossible for there to be a national housing bubble. It couldn't be. And people were told these are real factors. So your house is going to keep appreciating. So no wonder Americans don't save. They figured they'd be suckers to save. I'm sitting on an infinitely appreciating asset. Why should I bother saving? So in other words, people are misled into doing things they wouldn't have done. And now they're realizing it. Now they're saying, whoa, I really shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have bought that fancy car. I shouldn't have taken that vacation. So again, in effect, they're continuing to build a house that can't be built, in effect. Okay, now, the one final point about my analogy is that it is a great illustration of what a recession actually is. And I realize this will come off sounding wrong to people when I say that the recession is actually not the bad thing. Now, of course, what I mean by that, I don't mean to say that when people lose their jobs, that's wonderful, and I'm secretly having a party and cake and balloons. But what I mean is that if we extrapolate from our master builder example, we consider that example. Notice that when he was working on this unsustainable project, that was the waste. That was the problem. He's building something he shouldn't have been doing. Okay? Production has been diverted from its normal channels into this false house plan that he was building. So the recession is the moment when he realizes the true supply of bricks and says, okay, wait a minute. I'm going to have to either abandon this project or I'm going to have to try and do the best I can with the situation I'm in and try and make a smaller dwelling or whatever I can possibly do. That is what the recession actually is. Because the boom period, that's the period when he's building the house. It looks great because he's employed. This looks great. But actually, if he's building something that the economy can't support, that's not great. That's actually wasting our resources. The recession is the moment when the economy catches up to what our Wizard of Oz guy is up to. When the economy says, there's no shortcut to wealth. You first have to save the resources. And if you haven't, then just fiddling with interest rates can't make you rich. The economy catches up with this and says, wait a minute, these projects can't be continued and shouldn't be continued because they are depleting society's scarce resources. These resources need to be reallocated elsewhere in the economy into healthy lines of production that can be sustained. That's what a recession is the attempt by the market to sort out, after the artificial boom created by the central bank, which of these investments really is sustainable in the long run, which isn't, which is a bubble, which is genuine, and all these things that are unsustainable, we need to start moving resources out of them and redeploying them into healthy, sustainable lines. So there should be, in that case, we can understand why there would be temporary unemployment while we try to figure out where various labor services need to go. What is actually in demand and what was just phony? Where does that need to go? Now, we can get a longer period of unemployment depending on what the government's response is. But there will be inevitably a short period as the productive structure is realigned in line with reality. Okay. Now, as I said, if you try to keep one of these unsustainable booms going by doing more of the same, by just creating more money, pushing interest rates still lower, all you're doing is prolonging the agony. Because when the bust inevitably hits, it will be much worse. In the same way that the bust is worse for the master builder if it comes to the very end of his construction of the house. It's worse. There are more resources squandered. The pain is much worse for him. He's anticipating selling this house all this time. That'll reimburse my expenses. And turns out, no, you might be able to get 1/10 of what you were expecting. So it's devastating. The longer you let it go on, the worse it is. And now, we are now living through the best example in our lifetimes of this principle in action. Because in the year 2001, Alan Greenspan, in the wake of the dot-com bust, the dot-com companies had a big boom period in the late 90s, which is another Fed-fueled piece of insanity. Companies with no obvious business model or profits or customers everybody was saying, oh, this is my get-rich-quick thing. That's one way, by the way, you can tell there's a central bank-induced boom going on, is people think they can get rich just by, everybody just goes on the stock market, you get rich. Everybody buys a house, you automatically get rich. Yeah, life's not that easy, it turns out. Well, anyway, in the wake of that, when that went sour, Alan Greenspan in 2001 basically decided, all right, you know what, I'm sick of this whole economic downturn thing. Let's get things moving again. So we got 11 rate cuts in the year 2001. Let's force those interest rates down. That'll make us prosperous. So notice what happened. Instead of letting that recession do what it's supposed to do, which is correct all the errors caused by the initial boom, instead, he perpetuates it. And in particular, notice that the recession of 2000-2001 is the first one on record in which housing starts did not decline. So people naturally drew the false Federal Reserve-fueled conclusion that, well, I guess no matter what happens to the rest of the economy, housing is always robust. Housing prices just always go up, and housing is the best investment you can make, and you can make a lot of money flipping houses. That's a good way to spend your money. So in other words, people drew these conclusions and acted on this basis because the market was not fully allowed to correct itself. Because, in effect, Alan Greenspan gave everybody some heroin. And we acted on that basis. So by trying to ease us out of that, what did he give us? The current situation. Now, Greenspan himself now is saying the fashionable thing. The fashionable thing is, the free market has a flaw in it. Greenspan gave this testimony. He said, I've discovered a flaw in the free market. Yeah, Alan, why don't you look in the mirror? Because then maybe then you'll find the flaw. So again, it's not the free market doing this. I mean, investors normally have a fear of loss, and they can assess these things much better. Now, without the Fed, had there been no Federal Reserve System, we would not have had a housing bubble. We would not have seen house prices go to these absurd heights. And the reason is, let's suppose in the absence of a monopoly government, and again, the Fed is not technically a government agency, but without the government monopoly of creating money out of thin air, it would be nothing. So it's a quasi-government thing. If there hadn't been such a thing, and all of a sudden, let's say, for some reason, we had just all become irrationally attached to buying houses. This was just everybody's new hobby. We all just started going out buying houses. What would have stopped that? Well, the house prices would have gone up, as they indeed did in our own case,